On medium wave at FM stereo, this is National Radio 1. Born 1949, died 1985. This is a tribute to Phil Lynott.
Radio 1. Radio 1.
My name's Eric Bell, and I'm the founder member of Thin Lizzy. The story goes like this. I used to play in an Irish show band called The Dreams up till nearly the end of 1969. And I went one night to see a band called Skid Row playing in Dublin, and they were absolutely amazing. Gary Moore was the guitar player, and he was a good friend of mine. And I wondered what I was doing in a show band playing the type of music that we played. So I decided to leave the show band and try and form a group, three-piece group. So I left the show band, and I had some money saved up in the bank, which would keep me alive for about 6 weeks. So I went around all the clubs and all the pubs in Dublin looking for musicians to form a three-piece rock group with, and no one was interested, absolutely nobody. And one night I went to a club called the Countdown Club, and there was a band playing called Orphanage, and Philip was the singer. He didn't play bass then, and Brian Downey was the drummer. And I was totally mesmerised by Brian Downey's drumming. And I said to myself, I gotta get that guy for the band that I'm gonna form. So, for some strange reason, whenever the band took a break, it was only Philip and Brian came into the changing room. And after about 10 minutes I went in to the changing room, knocked on the door, and I said, come in. And I said, hello, my name's Eric Bell. I'm trying to form a band. Do you know any bass players and drummers? So, Phil looked at Brian and says, no, I don't know any, Brian, do you? And Brian says, no, I'm not too sure. This went on and on. So after about 10 minutes, I said, well, thanks very much anyway. We swapped a few phone numbers so we could keep in touch. As I was walking out the door, Philip said to Brian, hey Brian, do you fancy forming a band with Eric? Orphanages went as far as it can go. And Brian said, no, I think we're doing okay. And Phil said again, listen man, we've been together for about a year or so, we've done nothing. So Brian said, oh, okay, whatever you want to do. So Phil came over to me and he said, me and Brian will start a band with you for two reasons. And I said, what's that? And he said, number one, that we do some of Philip's songs, and number two, that Philip can play the bass. And I said, well, do you play the bass? He said, no, but I'm willing to learn. We were in Countdown rehearsing one day. We had been together about 4 weeks. We decided that we definitely needed a name for the band. So we finished rehearsing and started packing up the gear, and as we were packing up, we started talking about names and film titles, book titles, so on. And a few good names came out, and I said, what about Thin Lizzy? And everyone went, no. So someone else said something else, and no, so on. So after about 5 minutes, we all started going over all the names again that we'd said. And Thin Lizzy was one of the ones that registered in our heads. So I had this idea that I'm from Belfast, and down in Dublin they say tin instead of thin, and tick instead of thick. So I said, if we call the band Thin Lizzy, people will go out to see us in Dublin and say, oh, we're going to see Thin Lizzy tonight. And we say, no, it's not Thin Lizzy, it's Thin. So we get some controversy going with the name. So everyone thought this was a great idea, and the name stuck. I had to leave Thin Lizzy because of ill health. It was exhaustion and just a lot of things that were available, everyone knows by now in the music business. I was just a bit stupid at the time and very naive. And also there was a few other reasons. When we first started on the first 2 albums, I thought we were the only true Irish rock band. I mean Irish rock band. because we were doing acoustic numbers and very Irish influenced numbers as well. And once Whiskey in the Jar got in the charts, things seemed to change. You know, people would put pressure on us to play in a certain way and do this in a certain way and do that in a certain way. And at the time, I couldn't really handle it. On one side, I had my health problem, and on the other side, I had a chance to make a lot of money and a lot of fame and everything that goes with it, which I've worked for all my life. And once it was put to me, it was like someone saying, well, you can have your health, or you can have this. And I choose the farmer, you know, I choose my health, you know, which was more important to me.
How do you remember Philip?
A very colourful character, and amazing energy. There's so many different tracks, mean so much, you know, to... if I had to pick one, I suppose I'd pick Era. That's on the first album.
My name's Brian Robertson. I played with Phil and Thin Lizzy for 8 years. We first met when I came down from Glasgow. I was 18. And I actually came down to do an audition as a drummer for a band called Slack Alice, which I got. And the same week, a close friend of mine, known as Big Charlie, was roading for Thin Lizzy, and they were looking for a guitar player. So I went up and did the audition with Phil and Brian Downey, and simply got the gig there and then, and we started looking around for another guitar player. In came Scott, who you probably know from LA. And we started going out and doing club dates. And the feeling in the band was very, very natural at the time. Phil always kept it high energy. I can remember Scott saying to me that he couldn't believe the very first gig we did at I think it was the Lafayette Club in Birmingham. When we hit the first few notes, he was scared out of his pants because he couldn't believe all this jumping around that was going on and the energy that was going on stage from Phil. And it kind of took him back a bit, you know. He stood for about 10 minutes watching Phil. So did I, actually, before he could actually get into the whole thing. He had amazing energy on stage that it used to drive everybody. I mean, at that point, as I say, we both were watching him, thinking, God, is this what we're supposed to do? 10 minutes later, we were both doing it, and all three of us were at it. He got everybody at it, including the audience and everybody else. He was a master of live gigs. He was a total master. He knew exactly what to do, when to do it, what to say. Even down to the running order of the set list, you know, where you would play one song, where you would play another. He knew exactly how to place the songs, and sometimes he'd change them in the middle of the gig, because the feeling he was getting, obviously, from the audience wasn't. He thought, oh, well, we won't do this one, we'll stick this one in here, and then we'll really get it. And it worked every time. He worked 25 hours a day if he could. He really would. And he'd get you at it too. I mean, you'd end up being exactly the same. I was never out the studio. It didn't matter whether it was bass overdubs or vocals, or a keyboard player was in to do a bit, or guest players or whatever, or mixing, or the most mundane things. It wouldn't matter. He got you inspired to the point where you stayed there as well, and you put your bit in too.
Was he a funny man? Could he make you really belly laugh?
He was hilarious when he wanted to be, yeah. He had a great sense of humour. He was a very Irish sense of humour, but there was always, as you know, in any band, there's always a band sense of humour. and certain little sayings that everybody in the band knows but nobody outside does. And he was usually the one that would trigger those sayings off, you know. Him and Brian Downey, because they were both so close and they grew up together, the two of them used to come up with some crackers. They had us in stitches. I mean, even when things weren't, you know, if you had, like, I can remember in the early days, I can remember doing one drive through East Berlin, a really long one to Hamburg, that's the drive. And we had our manager, Chris Morrison, in the car. Now, it was a Granada, an old Granada. And there was 3 people in the back, and a driver, and Phil in the front, and Chris Morrison sitting on top of the brake. And you're talking about a 4-hour drive or something. And everybody was getting pretty narked, you know. It was a long drive, and we had to make it in a certain amount of time to do a certain show. But he had us all laughing most of the way, because you could see everybody getting a wee bit uptight, and especially me with my temper. He used to keep me well and truly level, you know. He'd stop me getting too uptight. And I mean, he could be well uptight himself if he wanted to be, but he'd make sure that nothing would affect the gig, nothing at all. You know, you could argue and shout after it, but the build up to the gig or whatever, he made sure everybody was in the right frame of mind to do it.
If you can imagine now that you're at a gig and you're on stage and you're in the middle of a set, which song would you like most to be doing now?
I think probably Still in Love with You is the one that I most enjoyed playing, and the one that I played probably with the most heart out of all the songs I ever played with Phil and Lizzy. Which is kind of funny, you know, with it being a ballad and whatnot. It's one of the classic rock ballads. There aren't an awful lot of them around, even to this day. You could call it an evergreen, really, couldn't you? It'll never fade from my mind, and I can still see myself up on the stage and walking out the rostrum with a guitar and starting to play the solo and just feel shivers going up my spine, and it would make me play better, and you'd always know he was there behind you.
I'm Peter Eustace, and I've been the sound engineer for Thin Lizzy for quite a long time, but that wasn't the original position, job, whatever you like to call it, that I took with Thin Lizzy when I first joined them. I started working for them doing lights and moving the equipment around as well, with another gentleman called Dennis, who used to drive the van, a little Volkswagen van with all the gear in it, a little trailer, and all the band and us used to travel together to the various gigs and so on. And later on, the lights tended to sort of not be used so much. It was more like sort of elbow grease, getting the PAs in, the back line sorted out. So that's what I ended up doing. And they got in various sound engineers, and we had a very good one called Pete Selwood. But he left, and we got another gentleman in, and that failed. So they just slotted me in the seat one night to see how I'd do, because they hadn't anybody else to do the job. And I did it, and they seemed to think I was all right. And I went out and kept on doing it, kept on doing it, and kept on doing it. Although I really wanted to do the lights, but Phil wanted to keep me on sound. They didn't have money for lights, so that's what I ended up doing. And even at that point, Phil used to take a great interest in sound and what was going on. He was a perfectionist, hard-working perfectionist, as you might hear quite a lot said about Phil. You'll hear the word workaholic, and he was a definite workaholic. Tremendous amount of energy. I always thought of him as a dynamo, terrific sun just burning away, taking in influences from all around him. He listened to a lot of music and influences. He liked poetry a lot as well, and this is reflected in some of the softer sides and the veins of his music. I lived with him for a while, and I used to see the other side of his nature. He's a very secretive person, very outgoing, it was hard to get close to him in a way, because there's a terrific amount of energy coming at you. He was a person that came at you. You would be drawn to his presence, whatever, but it was, to get very close to him, you just felt this terrifically powerful person there, his greatness about him. And he used to keep the other side of his life, his private side of his life, private. I remember one day we were travelling in the van, and I used to be into sort of esoteric philosophies, Zen and what have you. It was a vogue at that period. And I was sort of getting into some deep philosophical point with him. And he just turned around to me and said, "Look, man, don't get inside my head." And he just didn't go for any of that hippie philosophy at all. He had definite views and definite feelings and definite taboos about what he should and shouldn't do. He used his intuition a lot when he was talking to people. You could see that there was something else. When you were talking to him, there wasn't so much a great intellect there. There was a great intuition and the street sense that was surveying you and weighing up the pros and cons of it. And once he'd decided, that was it. All his confidence went into it, 100%. Philip's social side tended to sort of take on, just go to what was near him. He liked the city. He liked the city lights. I remember we recorded an album in Worthing. He couldn't stand the thought of being out of what was happening. He needed people around him. Very warm, he needed to be gregarious. He just needed people there to exist. And being in Worthing just wasn't his idea of being a rock star. He said to me once, actually, he said that he'd never live in Hollywood because that would be the end of him. He saw the dangers of living in Hollywood. That was far too crazy for the likes of Philip. And from what I've seen, when I was with him for, I've known Philip since I first saw him in Ireland 17 years ago. And I've been in close contact with him for over 12 years, or even more. Philip was one that would drink, and he could drink a lot of people under the table, but I never saw him really go out. I've never really seen Philip drunk as such. There's a lot of talk about other things. I've never seen him do any of the substances that allegedly he's supposed to have done. And this is something that's very close. I'm sure there are other people that may have seen it, but I haven't. To me, the way Philip lived his life was one of, he burnt the candle at both ends, and he burnt it in the middle as well. I was in Hollywood once, and we were lying by the pool of Sunset Marquee, and he turned around to me and said, I haven't been to bed for, I think it was 4 days or something. And I just looked at him, and to me, one day without sleep, and I'm on Boot Hill, and here he was, after 4 days, and he looked quite reasonable, and he was coherent and so on. I think that takes a great toll by not sleeping, by not taking rest, and so that you shift your system, your body system becomes weak, so that you don't have to take a lot of things that are going to damage you to actually achieve the results that he later perhaps achieved. Life on the road with Philip was one continual, you never knew what was going to happen. You'd have everything set up, everything be ready for the band to arrive. And you just hear this, like these stage doors being kicked and somebody screaming in a very deep Irish accent, "Get the bleak doors open," and you come in, and he would just push and push and push. He'd push everybody, musicians, crews, lighting engineers, what have you, to the limit. And he wasn't satisfied. Even if he knew you were giving 100%, he'd just do a run through to keep you on your toes.
But would he drive himself as hard as he drive others?
He'd drive himself harder. He would set a standard. He might not always achieve the standard of the other members of the band. Like, I don't think Philip would claim to have been the best musician in the band at any stage. But he would reach his own level of proficiency. But he could see in others their level of proficiency, the level that a lead guitarist could go to, and he would push them to that. What Brian could do on solos and various, the keyboard players we had. And he would just push everyone until he saw that it was right, that he was getting the adrenaline.
What do you think then was so special between Thin Lizzy and Thin Lizzy's audience? Because there was always a pretty spectacular feel, interchange of energy between the two?
I think that came about very much on the Slade tour, when we were touring with Slade, and they were just humongous. They were just the bee's knees in Britain. Everything was there, and we were just stunned by this band to go out there and get everything going. And well, on the first night of that tour in Newcastle, the bang went on, came off, and I believe it was Chaz Chandler came in the dressing room and just went crazy with the band. He says, you know, if that's the kind of show that this band puts on, they can just forget it, they're off the tour. You know, because Philip in the early days didn't do a lot of moving. He used to stand there, he'd say nothing between songs. He was shy. This is one of the things I noticed in Skid Row when he was with him. He'd stand there, he'd be very shy, but you could feel this. To me, you know, like that's who I remembered seeing on stage, this very shy but very charismatic person. And he actually broke down, he was in tears at this on the first night of the Slade tour. And from then on, he realised he had to get his act together, and then he started to chat to the audience. And to do that, he had to trust the audience. He had to give them what was inside him. And I don't think he'd really ever done that with anybody before in his life. And the audience took to this sincerity and this sort of humility, which was unusual.
My name is Scott Gorham. I played lead guitar with Thin Lizzy, and I joined in 1973 until the band broke up in 1983.
What is the first sort of recollection that you have of the band becoming successful? Because in 73, it wasn't that big a band yet.
No, we were actually a pretty much of a club band, really, striving to get to the top just like everybody else. I mean, we'd play in clubs, and you'd walk in and you'd be on the stage, and the place wouldn't even be half full. So, you know, it took us quite a few years to actually get to our peak, you know, of being able to sell enough albums where you got gold albums, or to where your albums charted or singles charted. You know, we had to actually really work at it. I think the first indication of when we actually were that we'd actually made us when we actually came back from our first American tour, and we came into the Hammersmith Odeon, and we'd actually sold the place out. You know, I mean, before that, we'd still been playing in the clubs and really small theaters, where all of a sudden we found ourselves at the Hammersmith Odeon, you know, and the place was packed out, and as soon as we hit the stage, everybody just jumped up out of their seats. And I can remember all of us kind of looking at each other, saying to ourselves, well, what the hell's going on here, right? And I think that was because of it. We had some success in America with The Boys Are Back in Town, and I think it actually took being successful in America to actually show people in England that we were worth something.
It was very much an atmosphere of club, you know, of friendship, of camaraderie. When did this particular fondness between the band and the audience develop?
It was really Phil's idea of stopping the idea of being the rock band that has put themselves on the pedestal that's way above the audience. It was his idea to actually say, well, let's every night after the show, let's bring anybody that wants an autograph or that wants to talk to us or ask us questions or anything, just let them come right on in, and we'll sign every autograph and answer any question they want. And we did this every single night, right? And so you can imagine, after touring for months and months, you'd get to that night where you'd say to yourself, or I would, you know, geez, I've had enough, you know, I don't want to stay afterwards, all I want to do is get to the hotel. And sometimes I would, but Phil would actually stay there every single night and sign every single autograph and talk to anybody that wanted to talk to him. I mean, I had to hand it to him. It was pretty good on the energy side there to be able to keep that kind of thing up, you know, especially when I knew how tired he actually was.
Did he drive himself too hard, do you think?
Well, I think Phil was a bit he was a bit of a workaholic. You know, he
you got to remember, Phil was the main visionary of the band, right? He always seemed to know where he wanted to go with what we were doing. He always seemed to have the main ideas, right? And most of us would, we couldn't agree with everything that he came up with, but 9 times out of 10, everybody would say, well, right, that sounds like a good idea to me, let's go that way, I remember the day he actually came into the studio with the lyrics to Dancing in the Moonlight, and he seemed to be really pumped up about this one certain song, and he came storming in the doors, and he said, listen, everybody sit down, you've got to hear the lyrics to this song, which he never really normally did. So we all sat down, and he read off the lyrics to us, and we thought, yeah, all right, let's do that. That sounds great. I think one of the main things that I remember about Phil was we all knew what it was like to be a support band and how tough it was on you. I mean, you tried to you tried to play to the main act's audience for very little money and hardly any adulation at all. So Phil actually, he knew this, he knew what it felt like, so inevitably almost every support band that we would have on our show, you'd always find him backstage in their dressing room trying to show them the ways to actually build their sets to, you start out here and then you want to build it up to this point here, then bring it down a little bit there, and then really hit them in the head with your last songs. Kind of really trying to teach these people how to win the audience over, even though they were our audience. Get out there and really fight for it, right? He actually gave these people, a kick in the rear end, just so they wouldn't get discouraged about the whole thing. A point of fact is Huey Lewis was one of the people that were supporting us. He was in a group called Clover, and they were actually getting killed on the tour. I mean, they would walk on, and people would actually started throwing things at them. Nobody would be listening. Nobody would actually be coming into the hall. So that's when Phil would actually go backstage and actually showed them how to put his set together. And I think to this day that probably Huey actually learned quite a bit through that experience.
You recorded a significant amount of music with him, lots and lots of music. What piece of music do you think is fitting to play now?
I think he would probably like to hear Bad.
This is Snowy White here. I worked with Phil from 1980 to the summer of 1982, which was obviously a very interesting time for me. The thing about working with Phil was that I always felt so confident on stage that he could actually handle whatever turned up at the gig, whether all the power went off or the audience was shouting things or things went wrong. Phil was such a good performer and that he would always handle it really well, so I could just concentrate on playing the guitar. We always used to kick off with Are You Ready?, which is a really great song to kick off with. I used to enjoy running out on stage and going into that number. It's true that Phil and I were on different wavelengths and I guess you could say completely different personalities. Phil was a hellraiser and a hard-living guy who just lived solely for his music and the lifestyle involved. And I tended to be a lot quieter, which I think everybody noticed. I tend to go to bed a bit earlier than the rest of the boys.
But after you'd actually been in the band and after you left, there were a lot of things recorded during the time that you were with the band and afterwards, which had a much, much softer side. Do you think that he picked up some of the more, if you like, emotional aspects of his music from your input?
Phil was actually going onto the softer side of things before I joined, I think, because he just released a track called Sarah, which was about his daughter, which I thought was a lovely song because he was a good songwriter, and that was very mellow. And his solo albums were much more mellow than any hard-rocking Thin Lizzy stuff. And there was that side to Phil that, in fact, didn't come out with Thin Lizzy, which obviously he was pleased to get out of him with the solo albums. I think there's different sides to everybody, really. There's a hard, rocking, heavy side to me as well, which comes out now and then, but I'm more in the other mellow direction. For instance, the title track of the Renegade album was, I thought it was a good track, and a lot of that was down to me, the actual mellow side of the guitar, and I thought really it was a nice change. When you're on the scene, as long as Phil had been on the scene, I think you've become established in the respect that when somebody thinks of the music scene and a certain aspect of it, they see the figure of Phil, because he epitomises the certain aspect of the music. In this case, it was the hard rock side of things. And I think he added certainly the excitement that is lacking from a lot of bands, just because of his lifestyle and his attitude towards things. He really was a musician. I don't mean necessarily he could read music well or play instruments particularly well or anything, but he was a musician in that he lived for playing music, playing the bass, and the whole lifestyle that evolved around it.
So, I mean, it was the highlight of his life at any moment of time to get up on that stage, put the bass between his legs and roar.
That's right. That was the moment for Phil, when he got on stage and played the bass and sang, and the audience was there with him, shouting, cheering, and it elevated him to the highest that he wanted to go, I think. He wouldn't have had it any other way, though.
Hi, this is John Sykes. I first met Phil in Ireland when I was doing a solo single. He very kindly said he would do this single with me. We got together with a producer called Chris Tangaridis, and that was the first time we met each other, and he quite liked me, and I was really excited to meet him, because he was, prior to this, when I used to just play in club bands and things, what I used to do was play Thin Lizzy tunes. And so it was a real buzz for me to see Phil. I remember when I first met him, it was really exciting to see him, and even just to get in a car with him and watch people's expressions on their faces as we drove past and they'd see it was Phil was just unbelievable. So shortly after that, he asked me if I'd like to take the place of Snowy and Thin Lizzy, which was just a dream come true for me. So naturally I just took the gig straight away, and we'd flown back from Dublin back to London, and it was only a matter of 3 days or something, and we was in the studio starting the Thunder and Lightning album. Well, I didn't know any of the tracks. I just walked into this big studio. It was the first time I've been in a studio like that. It was a great studio, Eel Pie Studio, Pete Townsend owns it. And I walked in, I was overwhelmed by everything. And so what we did was, everyone was just standing in the actual studio part where the band, there was Brian up on a drum riser, and we was just standing around. Scott was sitting down, and I was sitting down, and Phil was there, and he just said to me, this was the first time I hadn't even played with a band before this, and he'd already asked me if I wanted to join, just from the work we did with the single. And so he said to me, just play a riff, any riff you like. And I just started playing a riff, and he said, yeah, we used that bit, and then we just started jamming around for about an hour or something, you know. And an hour later we had Cold Sweat, which turned out to be the single off the album, you know, which was doing quite well. He was a genius in the studio. If Phil would do things in the studio which you'd listen to, you know, he'd lay one track of vocal things down and you'd think, what's he doing? That's never going to work, you know. And then he'd put another 2 or 3 parts to it, and it'd just be unbelievable, the thing that he'd thought up, because you just wouldn't think of it. He'd just come out with it, and that'll be that. You could get on a stage with Phil, and it wouldn't matter if half the equipment went down, or if you made the worst mistake in the world. Phil would just look round and laugh at you, and as if it was nothing. He'd just, you know, no pressure. I never felt pressure getting on a stage with Phil, because you knew as soon as Phil walked on a stage, I mean, he was the best in the business. As soon as Phil walked onto a stage with Lizzy, he'd have the audience eating out the palm of his hand. There'd be no problem there. There was never any, I mean, Phil was the main thing. I mean, without Phil, Thin Lizzy's nothing. You know, it's like Phil was Thin Lizzy. I mean, Phil always come across as a hard-living, hard-going rock and roller, but Phil was really a romantic at heart as well, wasn't he? I mean, some of the lyrics he'd write were just... I mean, the song Still in Love With You, that was one of my favourite songs to play, and it always touched me, you know, the way he'd sing it and everything, because he put so much emotion into it. So as much of the side of him that would be really hard and rocky and heavy going and big, tough Phil, he had this soft side, you know, which was unbelievable. I'd say he was an unbelievable talent, an unbelievable friend, and I think he was just a true gentleman and dedicated beyond belief to the work he did. He was the ultimate rock and roll star. I mean, people say Elvis was the king of rock and roll. Phil was the king of rock and roll, for sure.
I'm Brian Downey. I used to play drums with Phil and Thin Lizzy. I met Phil years ago, 1965 in school. We went to the same school in Dublin, where I'm phoning from now. Philip was a great character in school. He was the only black guy in the whole school. And this school is a very big school. I suppose there's about 4,000 or 5,000 pupils in this school. It was a big Catholic school in Ireland here. I used to see him in the schoolyard playing football, and he more or less stood out. Like, he was very, very, you know, very recognisable. You knew who he was immediately, and he was very popular. He used to have kind of a gang around that time, which I wasn't in at the time, but we used to hang around together, go to the cinema, go to most of the concerts, clubs and things. And he was one of the greatest characters around Dublin in the music business, in the music scene. Even before he started playing, he was always into different kind of music, different clothes. He used to hang around most of the record shops around Dublin looking for obscure songs to do. Even in the schoolyard, he used to sing things that nobody ever heard, and they used to sound great.
Can you remember at all, Brian, anything that he might have sung in the schoolyard, or when you were mucking about having a couple of illicit Guinnesses or whatever?
Well, as I say, it was more like sort of like some of the early soul tunes, like Ray Charles, Crime Time was a big favourite of Philip's. He used to have some fantastic albums that, I mean, nobody really collected in Ireland. He used to send away, I think, to America even, if he couldn't get a record. He used to send off to the States for it. And when he formed the Black Eagles, some of these tunes we used to do, I can't remember them offhand, but I remember they were quite obscure for the time. Phil used to travel around the folk clubs in Dublin too, don't forget, playing with most of the traditional players in Ireland. He used to play in a club in Bagot Street in Dublin. I can't remember the name now, but he used to be down there with Eric Bell, with two acoustic guitars, recite poetry, and then play a few songs in a kind of traditional way. And I think he became interested in poetry by hanging around with a lot of the traditional players in Ireland. Phil was very interested in the Irish situation. I mean, in school, he was very into history, Irish history. He used to know a lot about the early days in Ireland, more so maybe than me. I never really took much of an interest in history, but Phil seemed to have a great grasp of Irish history. He was into all the Irish mythology and all this, like Cuchulainn and Dadannan, people like that, who were supposed to be like the Irish High Kings of Ireland years and years ago. And Phil, I think, maybe was very influenced by all this Irish history. Some of his songs in later days, like with Thin Lizzy, things like Emerald, he definitely had an interest in. He was very upset, I remember, when the Irish trouble started here in Ireland in 1969. And he delved into the past a lot. He used to quote things from like the old school books and things like that, going back years and years. He seemed to have a great idea of the suffering and stuff in the world, and I think he used to fret over a lot of the problems, the Irish problem and world problems, but I don't think he took it that serious. I can't really believe, I can't understand how he died. I was speaking to him 7 days before Christmas. We did a show in England, Razzmatazz, and he seemed in great spirits then. He was fine. Coming up to Christmas, we had a few drinks together. He wanted to do his own solo album in January. He was booking some studio time in London, and in fact I was supposed to fly out sometime this month to do the recording with him. He wanted to reform Thin Lizzy with myself and Scott Gorham and John Sykes around March. He wanted to get on the road around March or April to do a tour and to see how it goes. But that won't happen now.
Can I just ask you to, in your own words, thinking of all the Lizzy material that you've created over the years, to introduce a song that you would consider to be a fitting tribute?
There's so many songs that could be a tribute, but one that does spring to mind, I suppose, is he was a great fan of Elvis Presley's too, and I suppose King's Cole would be a very fitting tribute to Phil now.